All right, welcome back, all. Um, we are going to be doing macroeconomics, chapter 19 today, and we're going to be talking about macroeconomic policy around the world. This is my stuff right here, so I'm really excited. There's going to be a lot of content in this one. So here we go. If you want to pause me, we'll jump in. We'll start at section 19.1 and just sort of talk about how worlds are structured, how economies are structured in the world. All right. So if you look at this first graph, this is a interesting graph. It shows all the OECD countries in 2012 and their per capita income. You can see that Luxembourg is, way off the charts. It's a really, really tiny country. So it'd be like if you put Singapore or Monaco, that sort of thing, hyper rich, very, very small countries. But Norway and Switzerland, we're starting to get back into like just regular sized countries now. Have much higher PPP. A lot of this is due to their products. You get more bang for your buck kind of thing. You also get a lot from your government. A lot from your government, So the standard of living for the standard of living for the average person is not only better than in the U.S., but the standard of living when it comes to income inequality is also very, very different. The United States is also a highly rich country. Used to be, for a long time, the richest country, at least per capita PPP, used to be the richest country in the world. It's been surpassed quite a lot lately. And a lot of economists are starting to suggest that this is because of the inequality in our system and that we're not at our production possibilities frontier curve because we're not getting full economic participation from a pretty large proportion of our society, right? So this is one of the reasons that they're suggesting we're sort of dropping down the list a little bit. A couple things that I would note here. All of these countries are free market. They all vary on what the definition. Right, free market and communism, this is not Manichaean. This is not black and white. Free market is on a spectrum. And so all of these except maybe Turkey isn't really all that free market. But anyway, just to note, all of these are free market countries. None of these are... Ow. I rolled my ankle and I just banged it against the desk. None of these countries are sort of communist or command-driven economies. All of these are free market, global participators, free trade, and they have differences in sort of social safety net systems and that idea, but none of these are socialist or communist nations by any means. Okay. But there are differences. So the United States and Australia are sort of, I would say, on the very far end of free market, and they're doing really well. And this is because of the friction that is reduced in the society, right? Or not in the society, in economics. It might actually increase societal friction. Excuse me. These are highly free market societies. They tend to have the lowest levels of unemployment, and you probably would throw like Korea and Japan on here as well, and maybe the UK, all really highly free market. But then on the other side, you have some high social safety net states as well, with a lot higher standards on labor laws, hiring and firing. Sort of a much broader welfare system, and these would be states like Norway and Switzerland. And their argument is that they're getting their middle class and their lower class involved in the economy, and even involved in things like saving, so that the state and firms can borrow against that savings. We'll talk about countries that don't have savings. And so it's an interesting battle that's sort of going on philosophically within free market economists. Do you want to look more like the Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, Scandinavian states, who also, I would say, survived 2008 really, really well and just sort of kept on going. There was a little blip, but a lot of the more free market states and a lot of the more social safety net states like Greece, Portugal, Spain were also disastrous. So you had the hyper free market and then the sort of hyper protectionist U.S. and then Greece, Portugal, Spain, all sort of collapsing. But then you had that sort of middle ground, Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, Sweden, all did relatively better than those extremes, So there are still debates and there's still research being done on the data that was collected. But there's some very interesting debates, and there are new ideas in economics being pushed because of what we discovered post 2007, 2008 with Norway and Switzerland. On the other end, like I was saying, Greece, Portugal, at the very bottom of the list, Turkey, these states are either wildly free market. Mexico is pretty bad. It's gung-ho down there, and Turkey's pretty bad too. And then on the other end, you have Greece and Portugal, who are hyper-protectionist. They have really extreme retirement packages. It's really hard to fire people for poor performance. They have crazy pension laws and really early retirement, 58 or something. I don't know if that's true, but that might be hyperbolic. But they're sort of on the other extreme end than Mexico, where it's just a free-for-all sort of thing that doesn't have a whole lot of protections for anyone. So again, I mean, things are on this curve. It's not just communist versus right. There are a plethora of different ways of running an economic system. So I just wanted to point out that the top players are interestingly different, and we really still don't really yet know how the free market, at least the top level free market states, are gonna move toward in the future. And even America looks like it wants to become a little more progressive, at least under the sort of Biden administration and with the recent election. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the near future. All right. Okay, here is another one, 19.3, which I think is a cool picture, and there are different versions of this, right? Depending on how states measure GDP, or is it just the World Bank measuring blah blah blah. The point is, you see the greens. You want to be brighter green. So generally, North America, Europe, and then I wouldn't even say the Middle East, but the oil states like Oman, Saudi Arabia, these sorts of states can be hyper-rich. Australia, Japan, all of these high free market states. Okay? But this gives you a nice picture of sort of what's going on in the world. And I would even say that China is moving up toward more green because this is only from 2008. And so if you look at where China is today, they're pushing past that sort of $7,000 range, $7,000 to $8,000 per capita. And so they would probably be on the sort of the poop green looking one. Okay, so why do we see these differences, right? There are a lot, and the book gave 4. A couple of them were pretty lame. I would like to talk about some of the stuff that I've learned over a decade of research. So we have geography is a very important one. I will give them that. You do not want to be a landlocked country. In America, you can even see this phenomenon where most of the economic activity is driven by the coasts, right? And it's just because they're the coasts, and that's where goods and services are imported and exported from, and so there are logistical reasons, such as you want to be producing near the coast so that you have a short supply line to get your goods to the international market, right? So those are the logistical reasons. There are supply reasons because you want to have short supply lines for your inputs coming in from the international market. There are also the sort of the marginal gains that you get from being near other companies that want to be near the sea, right? And so all of these things are really important, and they drive economics, at least in today's globalized world. And they always have, really. If you look at sort of the history of the world and colonialism and imperialism and the British and German and French and Spanish fleets, trying to go around the world and snatch up strategic ports. And you can even see it today with China and their sort of one belt, one road policy, trying to build particular infrastructure, especially near the sea, for their own strategic interests across Southeast Asia and Africa. So geography is very, very important. And if you're a landlocked country, you're in a lot of trouble. And this is the Democratic Republic of Congo. This would be like, Colorado, I guess, if you were a United State. Maybe New Mexico, because they have it worse, because they also have a desert, and no real access to the ocean. So geography is important. Demography is also important, but more demography is driven by the structure of the economic system that already exists in the world, right? So rich countries will tend to have older populations, for a number of different reasons. And this is because of improving healthcare. It's because as individuals and societies become richer, they start to have fewer children. And that is because of not only sort of Maslow's hierarchy and the need to self-actualize, but it is also because of the reduced need for little workers running around your farm, right? And helping you feed everyone in your community, and having a need to maybe have like 12 of them, because 6 of them are going to die from diarrhea or disease or something before they're even 2 years old. And the world just looks very different as you become richer and richer, and your incentives to have children or not to have children and how many children you have change. And it's not the same for every society or whatever, but these are sort of the trends that we see on average. And so the really poor and agriculturally driven societies across the planet, who are also tend to be uneducated and don't have access to things like condoms and these sorts of things, they have a lot more children. The adults die younger, and so you just have a whole lot, like the whole society in some of these places, like 55 or 60% of the population is under 25 or 30 years old. It's wild. And most of them don't have jobs, and it becomes a serious problem. How do we educate when the entire population is under 20? How do we afford that? It is a very strange and difficult situation to get yourself out of, and it takes education, and it takes sort of spreading knowledge across the society, sort of door to door. It takes improvements in standards of living. It takes all kinds of things, but it's there, and that's one of the differences for sort of serious growth problems and even money problems across the world. You have differences in agricultural structure, industrial structures, right? And you have some states are agricultural, sort of traditionalist societies. We see this in a lot of the sort of landlocked sub-Saharan African states, and even some of the more landlocked South American countries, right? And then you tend to move sort of linearly, honestly, from agriculture to basic industrial production to intermediate industrial production to high-level technology and services. We don't really know if that's the route anymore because the economy looks so different than it did in the 1930s to 50s. So more research needs to be done about how to get some of these smaller or just devastatingly poor countries out of this poverty. We'll talk about some of how to do that here in a little while. But this is one of the things too. Like, and again, this is a lot like demography. Like, is it because your nation is poor that the demography is occurring like it is, or vice versa, right? Is demography causing poverty? This is a really tough question. It's called the endogeneity problem. Which way does the causation run? And it's the same way here with what does your structure look like? The market structure look like? Is the market structure driving you being rich? Or, can you only be a technologically advanced society because you're rich? And in a sense, it's a little of both. And so this is part of the problem of writing policy is how do we disentangle the endogeneity? Okay, moving on. Economic institutions are very, very important. We will talk about some of these things when we talk about some of the third world, lower income economies in the world, okay? Economic institutions, we have talked before about central banking, the Fed in America, and how independent it is. It's highly important that the central bank have independence from politicians, because if politicians are able to get their hands on how much currency is being printed, or interest rates or reserve rates or whatever it is, these guys don't know anything. They're just lawyers most of the time, or they're sort of community organizers, or they certainly are not economists. And so when central bank independence starts to crumble, a lot of these states start to crumble. And in reverse, as central banks become more independent and become divested from politics, like the daily politics of their country and elections and all of this stuff that doesn't have a lot to do with economics sometimes, they start to become richer. They start to be able to develop because investors are more able to trust that system will be stable. So even if it is swinging, it's not going to swing uncontrollably or for no reason because some politician changes his mind about things. That's not the way modern economies work, right? You need someone running the ship who knows what they're doing. And so the more divested your nation becomes from the central bank. And this is one of the problems with Japan. Japan, we've seen the sort of lost generation with their 30 years of just stagnancy. They've tried over and over to fix things, but one of the problems is the prime ministers have a lot of control over what happens with the central bank and reserve rates and interest rates and all of these sorts of things. So it can be quite disastrous, and it can be not only disastrous on the lower stages where it's easy for politicians to corrupt their systems, but even on the higher levels where it's a little more difficult. But central bank independence, we're finding, is incredibly important in stabilizing an economic system. Okay, corruption. Corruption is bad, right? And it is bad across the board, and for a number of reasons. It reduces investors' trust in a country. It reduces the likelihood that you will be able to get loans from the IMF or the World Bank or USAID or others, it reduces the connection, the responsibility to one's citizens, because now sort of taxes aren't involved. A lot of this is tied into resources, excuse me, not resources, but natural resources like diamonds or oil or gold, these sorts of things. Corruption and natural resources and the resource curse sort of run together, and it disconnects the need to be a good leader, because you can just get your money, assets, power, wealth, whatever it is. You no longer need your citizens for that. You can just dig it up out of the ground, right? And so corruption can be pretty devastating. For yet another reason is that corruption reduces the amount of investment that actually is going back into the economy, right? If it's just leaders stealing money, that's not doing any long-term good, right? It's a net negative, and so it's not going to education or human resources or infrastructure or roads or bridges or ports or whatever it is. It's just lining the pockets of the rich. It also reduces the likelihood that investors are going to invest in your country, because they know there's really no long-term growth to be had if you keep just stealing all the money from the system, right? And so you can't attract foreign investment either, and it becomes this sort of self-feeding problem from numerous different angles. Are you market-oriented? This is a very important question. Communist or command-driven, or even what is known as autarkic, which is sort of a self-contained state, none of them work. None of them work for a number of different reasons, but the free market is necessary to be able to send signals about what works, what is worth purchasing, what new technology can improve my company, how can I invest into these things, and the more you sort of take that mechanism away, at least in a competitive system, because we've talked about the different systems, right? I'm not talking about a monopoly, that's just abusive. In a perfectly competitive system, all of these signals provide wonderful things. And if you do have competition in the system, it ensures that you will get growth. It ensures that the right companies will survive. It's sort of like the evolutionary mechanism in driving speciation and stuff like that, right? And so you have to have a market-oriented economy, or your country will fail. And it is just what we have seen over and over. Now, like we've talked about, that doesn't have to be a rapacious market economy. It doesn't have to be anarchy, right? That end of economics doesn't work either, as we see in places like Mexico. That sort of stuff doesn't work either. You need a nice balance, right? There are many situations in which the free market can be dangerous. Monopolies, monopsonies, all of these different sorts of things. So it's about nuance. Again, you have to be able to, if you want to manage an economy well, you need to know the nuanced situations. But we do know pretty much for a fact that you have to have a market-oriented economy. Even China has discovered this. Like you can't do it. And if you look at states like Turkey or Iran, where basically just the clerics are running the economy, this sort of black underground economy, or North Korea, it's a complete disaster. They don't work. They don't work. And they don't work for a lot of reasons, because politicians and leaders they can't understand every intricacy of the economy. You can't update pricing and supply and demand daily. It just does not work. And so this is something that we're learning. You must transition toward market-oriented economies. There is frustration with this in Marxist sort of pockets, especially in developing countries, who feel like that they've been abused and exploited by the economic system, and they sort of have a point, right? But we also know that the data shows those other systems don't work, and so we don't necessarily have to implement a hardcore anarchist free market system, but you have to have a semblance of free market, or you're doomed to failure, right? Homogeneity. This is important, and this is a really touchy one, and we've touched on this one some. Homogeneity is difficult, and we find that in nations where you have more homogenous people, or homogenous religions, or homogenous ethnicities, or homogenous races, savings are higher. The likelihood that you're willing to share out with your community is higher. The likelihood that your state invests in human capital is higher. And these things also drive economics, right? Racism is an economic weight on the shoulders of the free market. It really is. It reduces efficiencies. It increases frictions. It reduces the numbers of buyers and sellers. All sorts of things, right? And so, while homogeneity can make things easier, there are wonderful things about different cultures, right? We also find through studies that it bolsters your feeling of community, at least in sort of the local level. It bolsters the options at the local level. It increases the number of jobs for people on the bottom. So there are a lot of benefits. You also get delicious food and all kinds of cool stuff. So homogeneity makes things easier for a society, right? I am not in any sense saying that we need to homogenize our society. Please do not think that is what I am saying. I'm just saying ethnic and religious tensions can cause economic tensions as well, right? And we'll also touch on conflict, right? Riots and civil wars and violence and terrorism, and all of these things are not conducive to economics and to the stability that investors need to be able to do what they do, right? For businesses to function correctly, for global trade to work correctly, for production facilities to work. None of this stuff works with riots and civil war, right? And this is not just an other, like they look other than me. This happens in all across so-called white societies, right? I mean, if you look at Ireland, this was a major issue. Thousands of people died. There were bombings of schools and churches and police and soldiers, and I mean, it was just devastating. And their economy was horrid. And as soon as you finally got the peace pact, their economy went through the roof. It was one of the fastest growing economies on the planet. And now their tensions are coming back, and they're starting to see economic problems again because of Brexit. And these are worrying trends, But I don't know. It's something I have to touch on because this is what I study. But I know it's a touchy subject. But there's so much there. It's a really interesting topic. Okay. Wallerstein's core versus periphery theory was really popular in sort of the 1980s and 1990s, and this is kind of the Marxist response, right? They're saying that no, you have this core set of countries like America, Great Britain, Germany, France, Canada to an extent, who basically try to continue this exploitative system that exists, right? We need a second and third tier set of nations around the world to be able to drive the first tier. So it's sort of the same argument you get inside of a nation about inequality, right? We are trying to force your wages down low, and sort of suck all of the value out of the system as the top. Well, they're saying that this happens on an international scale. And that big states try to do the same thing, force you into remaining a second-tier exporting sort of nation, and constantly try to push you out of the first tier. There's a little bit of evidence for this, right? And I would say if anyone's interested, go look at sort of the Dulles brothers in the 1950s and 60s. Who were running a lot of the economic systems in America, but also were running sort of the United Fruit Company, and exploiting laws and power and military and economic power, and so that they could make money on the back end on this stuff. And there's some really interesting stuff here. I'm going to leave it there. I'll leave it there. I think that there are arguments for and against this theory. But it's really fun. I hope one of you picks it up and writes a paper about it. Anyway. Like we talked about earlier, conflict is a major problem. Conflict is not conducive to good economics. If you have war, if you have a riot, not a riot, but like constant repeated rioting, if you have ethnic genocide or sort of religious tensions, or Shia versus Sunni, we've seen this as a problem, Catholic versus Protestant in Ireland and in Germany, these tensions arise, and they are not good for economics, all right? Stability is always best from an economic standpoint. From an aggregate economic standpoint, I shouldn't say there isn't a reason to protest or riot. That's not my intent. I just mean from an aggregate standpoint and a data standpoint, these things are not conducive to good aggregate economics right now. As an individual, if you're being exploited in a third world country, you may have a reason for rioting, and there may be a reason for you, like, this life is garbage for me, so what do I care about my country's long-term economic aspects if they're just going to keep exploiting me, right? I don't want to touch on a whole lot of any of that. I just want to say that, like, from an aggregate big picture view, conflict's not good. Colonialism, we know, and this ties into that Wallerstein theory that we were talking about earlier. The idea that colonial states sort of set up infrastructure and ports and everything else just to sort of extract wealth from these places, and train their societies to do just enough to help them extract wealth from these societies. Colonialism will probably always have an effect on economics and social standings and all kinds of stuff in the future. I don't think there's any going back at this point. So it always should be mentioned. And it is one of the reasons for differences in growth, right? If you're in a strategic position like Japan or South Korea was to the United States, they seem to be doing much, much better, and we sort of allowed them to protect and build industries more so than we ever did in Africa and Latin America, which were regions that we were afraid communists were going to take over, right? And so we didn't... this is tough. There are a lot of strategic reasons for why certain areas on Earth are more advanced than others, right? And so if you look at this map, this 19.3 that we were talking about, Argentina has been a particular focus because it is the bottom of the world, and generally it's doing better than most of South America. South Africa is the bottom of the world. It is a strategic, economic, and military point. It is doing generally better than the rest of Africa. Egypt used to be like this, but then they were taken over by the military. Australia, very economically advantaged and strategically advantaged. If you look at Japan and South Korea, also strategic points. So there are a lot of reasons why certain areas get more attention than others. Okay. Human capital is also a big one, and we have talked before about the differences in South America, who spent a lot of their investment and borrowing on military. And on sort of the ISI, the import substitution industrialization strategy, right? We want to build our own domestic economy. It's sort of the autarkic viewpoint that I was talking about earlier. They were the most concerned about Wallerstein's theory. They thought that all of these nations like America and England are trying to force them into this sort of export model, like South Korea and Japan to a certain extent followed. And so they took the other way, and they went with the import substitution industrialization. They thought that we can push our entire country through every stage. It didn't work. It didn't work at all. And part of that was because it wasn't supported by the United States, whereas Japan and South Korea were, right, because they were strategic partners. But part of it was because the strategy just didn't work. And instead of investing in infrastructure and education, they invested a lot in military and in trying to protect industries that couldn't compete, like cars and washing machines and all kinds of stuff. And so there were a number of different reasons why the ISI model was just sort of doomed to failure, but it was doomed to failure, as we've seen. Okay, so, man, we're already at 40 minutes. You know what? I'm going to call it there, and we're going to call this part 1, and then I will come back to part 2, because we still have a long way to go, all right? So I'll probably get it up either this afternoon or first thing in the morning. And have a great day, and I hope you're all happy and healthy. Bye.